It was bubbly, it was making a snap, crackle, pop sound, and it was just weirdly satisfying. I was super excited.
I'm Ronnie, and you're listening to Clean With Me, the podcast where I walk you through cleaning your house step by step. When you clean along with this show, you'll get more done in less time so you can spend the rest of your day doing what matters most to you.
Thanks for joining me. In today's episode, I'm going to talk you through doing your dishes and cleaning the kitchen, but this is also going to be a topical episode. I'm going to tell you about my experience with baking sourdough bread from a starter. I know it's a trend right now. This is not a how-to or anything. I'm basically going to tell you why I'm glad I did it, what I learned during my sourdough journey, however short-lived, and why I'm going back to my usual routine of baking bread with store-bought rapid rise yeast. Let's get right into the episode. It's time to gather up dishes from around your house. If you're not ready for the day yet, you need to get presentable or straighten up your front entrance or light a candle or whatever, you might want to pause the episode, because I want us to get right into the kitchen in this episode and gather up dishes from around the house. Maybe you have a mug on the nightstand. Maybe there's a cereal bowl in a teenager's room if you have teenagers. Or maybe something got left on the dining room table. Let's get all those dishes over to the sink area. So a little background, I've been baking bread for a super long time. My husband and I had a bread maker that someone gave us early in our marriage, and we went through a phase where we would buy these box bread machine mixes. You don't even see those very often in stores anymore, but we did bake a few loaves using those box mixes, and at some point we got rid of the bread maker. I'm not sure how long ago that was, but it was a super long time ago. But then about 14 or 15 years ago, I decided to revisit the whole bread machine thing. I got a bread machine and started baking bread using a recipe, the whole thing where you start with the liquid and the oil or butter, and at some point you add in your salt, sugar, and then I usually sprinkle it around the edges of the flour, and then I dig a little well in the center of the flour, pour in that rapid rise yeast, push a button. At first I was doing loaves start to finish in the bread maker. They were kind of a weird shape, but super easy. And I learned to check the dough ball, kind of early in the cycle, because sometimes I would need more flour or more water. I never really got into like weighing it on a food scale and being super precise, but I know that you're supposed to scoop the flour into the measuring cups and kind of level them off. And I learned that there were different measuring cups for dry measures, liquid measures, things like that. But ever since then, I've gone through phases where I would bring out the bread machine and start baking bread again. And before long, I went into just using the dough cycle a lot of the time, and then baking the bread in the oven after it's done its mixing and rising in the machine. And I've made dinner rolls, pizza dough, homemade hamburger buns, things like that over the years. Lately, I've been making French bread utilizing the dough cycle and then finishing it in the oven. And it's been just super amazing. By now, I'm sure you've gathered up any dishes from around the house. Maybe you're already emptying your dishwasher and or drying rack. Once you've done that, just do your dishes, whatever that means for you. Maybe you need to get some difficult pots and pans soaking, and then hand wash a few things, or maybe you need to get all your small stuff into the dishwasher and then just wash those remaining larger items. Just be plugging away on dishes while I talk, whatever needs to be done at your house. And as usual, if you're ahead of the game and you either only have a few dishes to wash or you're all caught up on dishes, be working on cleaning surfaces in your kitchen or organizing drawers, cupboards. Definitely try to stay in the kitchen during these kitchen episodes when possible. But of course, there's no right or wrong way to listen to this show. Maybe you're folding laundry and you just wanted to hear what I thought about the whole sourdough bread craze. But I'm going to assume that a lot of you are working on dishes. In 2020, I was mildly aware of the fact that bread making became popular from people being at home, who normally were at work and things like that. But apparently some people had trouble finding the yeast in the store. But I don't remember if I got particularly excited about baking bread during that time because it was something I'd already been doing off and on. And a jar of the rapid rise yeast tends to last me kind of a while. So I don't remember having trouble finding that in particular. But the reason I didn't really pay attention to the whole sourdough from wild yeast thing was the fact that I don't particularly like sourdough, or at least I thought I didn't. I mean, the kind of sourdough you could order in a restaurant or buy in a package at the grocery store is kind of sour. But this whole sourdough from a starter thing has gotten even more popular lately, it seems. It seems like everybody I know is making it. And since I've been on a major French bread kick, I started reading up on it a little bit, and I mentioned to my husband, I think I'm going to try this whole thing where you don't use the store-bought yeast, you get a starter from someone, or you make a starter, because I'm wondering if maybe I could just add sugar to it, turn it into sweet French bread, or whatever. Somehow the idea of making the bread even more from scratch kind of appealed to me. And if I'm going to be some kind of bread making guru, I've got to at least try this. You know what I mean? That was kind of my mentality. Well, right after my husband and I had this conversation, sadly, a guy in our church was killed suddenly in a tragic motorcycle accident. And so another friend of mine posted that she was giving out starters from his refrigerator. He had gotten her started on her sourdough journey, and she had been using sourdough for like a year and a half. So it was also going to be kind of cool to get a starter that belonged to this really cool guy and bake some bread in his memory. I know a lot of you probably made it in 2020 and I'm a little late to the game, but I was starting to get curious about it. Oh, and even before this, I had also experimented with making artisan loaves where it's like kind of the round loaf and you do it in a Dutch oven and carve a cross into it, but they were not sourdough. Again, it was with the store-bought rapid rise yeast and my bread machine's dough cycle. So there were two things that I just hadn't done yet. I had not made cinnamon rolls, which this friend of mine makes sourdough cinnamon rolls, and then this other friend of mine makes regular cinnamon rolls. So that's something I've been, wondering about. So I thought, well, if I don't like the sourdough bread, I could use it to make sourdough cinnamon rolls, and then maybe the sweet will counteract the sour. So while I was waiting to get the sourdough starter, I started doing research into making sourdough bread with a starter, how to make the starter, and I just learned a lot about it. And I thought I finally need to make my friend's cinnamon rolls, not the sourdough friend who was giving me the starter, but this other lady who uses yeast like I do. And I got some tips from her. I'm definitely glad I did, because there are a few tricks to making cinnamon rolls that you don't get just from reading the recipe. But they were so good, I was thinking, I don't see how using sourdough would improve on these. These are already just amazing. I wouldn't change a thing about these cinnamon rolls. And I was also thinking my husband really loves the French bread baguettes that I make, so how could I improve on those? Still, I wanted to try the sourdough thing. And this is a cleaning show, so keep working on those dishes. When you're done, work on the surfaces of your kitchen. And I'll keep checking in to remind you. So, long story short, I got the starter on a Sunday afternoon. I realized I needed to feed it and get it bubbly and, put a rubber band around a jar and wait for it to go up above the rubber band so that I could see when it had doubled in size. It didn't happen right away. What I ended up doing is dividing up the starter and starting a second one because I had read that whole grains can kind of speed things up. So I kept one kind of the same and just fed it. And then with the other one, I fed it whole wheat flour. And yes, I followed the directions and everything like that. Well, the whole wheat one did its thing quicker. The other ones rose a little bit and then fell, but it seemed like it never really doubled. Just the original one with the white flour in it. I think I used bread flour, and I think I made a mistake by using tap water instead of filtered bottled water, but the one with the whole wheat still worked. It was bubbly, it was making a snap, crackle, pop sound, and it was just weirdly satisfying. I was super excited. So I thought, well, I better make the dough before this thing falls. Because basically you're supposed to, and I'm by no means an expert, I'm just talking about my own experiences as a sourdough starter beginner. But supposedly you're supposed to wait till it doubles in size and either use it then or wait till it's just starting to go back down. But I don't think you're supposed to wait till it goes all the way down. So I thought, well, I don't want to take a chance of this thing falling down because the first one that didn't rise as much when I tried just that initial one, it never doubled, and then it also went back down. So I thought, well, I got to catch it before it goes back down. And I feel like this looks really good based on all the videos I've watched. This is good, craters bubbling and crackling. This is good stuff. So I went ahead and mixed the dough. One thing I was kind of excited about is I dusted off my stand mixer, which I hadn't used in a long time. And I was pretty pleased with how easy it was to just mix the dough in the stand mixer. I'm used to putting things in the bread machine, but I knew this was going to have a long rise time and that people who do sourdough don't really do it in a bread machine that often. So I mixed my dough, I took it out, and I did these fold things. I had instructions that came with my starter. And I was also armed with a lot of knowledge from a lot of conflicting videos. But by and large, I was following the instructions on the paper that my friend gave me that she got from the guy who passed away, who had taken a sourdough class, and that's where this official sheet came from. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to finish up those dishes, and then it will be time to work on surfaces in your kitchen, and then finally you'll be sweeping. So let's get those dishes done. I'm trying to light a fire under you here because sometimes the job expands to fill the time allotted. So I kind of want to give you a deadline on these dishes. Let's get them done. But I mixed the dough in my stand mixer, covered it with the damp cloth, and then I looked at the directions and realized it was supposed to rise for 10 to 12 hours, but no more than 36. Well, if I stopped it right at 12 hours, I'd be getting up at 2:30 in the morning. And I was already thinking, this is really inconvenient timing because the whole process of making the sourdough bread for me took almost 2 days. Okay, because I had to get the starter to the right point. And then there's this rise time, and of course I had to sleep. So anyway, I got up at, 5:30, 6 in the morning, whatever it was, the next morning, and I was pleased that my dough had risen, which I kind of knew it would because I knew that starter looked really good when I went to use it. And I formed them into baguettes because that was one of the options on that official instruction sheet, and I thought, well, I feel like the baguette shape is more foolproof than when I make an artisan shaped loaf in a Dutch oven. So what I did is I divided my dough into two baguettes and put them on parchment paper on a cookie sheet. I baked the bread and it came out great. I know I did it right because when I sliced into it, it had those big holes. And when I squeezed it, it sprung back, instead of staying kind of smashed like other breads tend to do. And it wasn't as sour as other sourdough bread. And obviously, when you have hot bread fresh out of the oven, what's not to like? So, came out great. It was a total success. And of course, even though I'm not a huge fan of sourdough, tasted good. It wasn't as sour. But one thing that kind of struck me is when I was cutting the loaf with my electric bread knife, it felt like I was using a chainsaw to saw through a log. I was surprised at how tough the crust was compared to the regular French bread. And I do make a crusty French bread with a nice crispy crust, but this was beyond that. It's really firm, folks. Again, it was like using a chainsaw, and this was a bread knife that usually just goes through a loaf of bread like it's butter. Electric bread knife. I have a regular bread knife, but I also have an electric one, and I was using the electric one. Okay, we're almost done with the dish portion, and we're going to move on to surfaces in your kitchen. If you haven't already, of course. But my husband praised the bread, but you never know when something is not someone's favorite and they're just being nice. I could tell he wasn't super excited about it. He said it was good, but I could tell he wasn't super excited about it, but I just wasn't really sure. I was pretty excited about it. And I redid my starters and everything, and the next day, or that same day, I went to work. For those who don't know, I work a couple days a week as a teacher's aide / substitute teacher / study hall teacher. Basically, I work at the school, but I only work Tuesdays and Thursdays. The starters rose and then fell while I was at work. And that's when I realized that the timing thing was just too complicated for me. And I realize some of you probably do all this all the time and have a system. Like my sister was saying, she has a friend who has a little side business and she bakes sourdough bread every weekend. And I realize you can put the starter in the refrigerator for weeks at a time, but you still have to bring it out, feed it, and get it to this peak condition before you can bake. And then you kind of have a small, in my experience anyway, you have a small window of opportunity in which to use your starter before you would have to feed it again and get it back to its peak level again. So you kind of end up mixing your dough at just some inopportune time, and then there's a super long rising time. It would definitely work better for a stay-at-home mom, but that friend my sister told me about works and does it on the weekend. But I like to make bread 3 or 4 days a week, and this was just a lot more complicated than what I was used to. Because normally I decide when I'm going to make bread, and a lot of times it's just based on when I clean my kitchen. Or more importantly, I like to have the bread come out of the oven right as dinner's ready so we can eat it hot and fresh. If I make 2 baguettes, I can serve one with dinner hot and fresh, let the other one cool, and then cut it with an electric knife, and then put those little slices in the bread box for mini sandwiches later, the next day or whatever. Basically, trying to coordinate a schedule for the sourdough proved too challenging. Because yes, making regular bread calls for a little bit of advanced planning because it takes a few hours to make it, but it's also pretty easy for me to, time it so that it'll be ready at dinner time rather than offering it to people at 6:30 in the morning. Again, I'm not claiming to be a sourdough expert. I know some of you have probably perfected the schedule or whatever. Be cleaning your kitchen surfaces if you haven't already started on that. I'm just giving you a review of it. Yes, it was cool, but it's not going to become part of my routine. But I will tell you a few reasons why I'm glad I did it. I mean, one of the pros was learning that I could make yeast using flour and water. Even though I didn't make the starter from scratch, while I was waiting to get the starter, I researched how I could make it from scratch. So, like over the course of a week where you're feeding and discarding or whatever, I learned how that worked, which is pretty cool. Because definitely in a situation where we go into like another Great Depression or pandemic, if for some reason it's hard to get yeast or it's hard to get store-bought bread or both, I could either get a starter from someone or maybe make my own starter and, make an affordable bread using like all-purpose flour, water, and salt. The starter is basically made out of flour and water. And of course, there was a sense of accomplishment because I was able to, do this complicated thing and make this bread using a starter, and I did it correctly. And I want to be able to say I've made it when I talk about baking bread and people are like, yeah, but have you tried sourdough? Now I can say yes. Another thing I learned, which was pretty positive, is that I don't hate sourdough. When I was thinking about what to do with the sourdough, I was realizing that I do eat sourdough bread in certain contexts, like at Pier 39 in San Francisco, where we order the clam chowder in the bread bowls. Those are sourdough, and you eat part of the bowl, and it's just super yummy in that situation. Or you go to a party and there's spinach dip and it's served in a hollowed out round sourdough loaf, and the insides have been pulled out and cut into cubes, and you're dipping those cubes in the spinach dip. That said, since I'm not super big on sourdough, I'm usually dipping like little baby carrots in the spinach dip. But I do feel like kind of dabbling in sourdough broadened my horizons a little bit. I realized that homemade sourdough tastes good, and I do eat sourdough in certain contexts that I mentioned. And, I kind of realized, hey, that's sourdough. But I have made bread bowls before with regular bread, and that's even better. My mom always says different people have different tastes. So no judgment here. If sourdough is your favorite kind of bread and you think maintaining a starter and baking is super easy, and some of you would probably tell me, yeah, but you could have put the dough in the refrigerator. Here's the schedule. That's great. But it was more like a bucket list thing that I wanted to check off. And anytime I try something, I tend to become obsessed in the short term and think like this could be like my new thing. I might start doing this all the time. Like I tend to take hobbies too far sometimes when they're not necessarily the right hobby for me. So yes, I have started my sourdough journey and ended it. It was short-lived. It was a great learning experience. That paper from The Dearly Departed is in my recipe binder in case I need to make sourdough again. But like I said, it would be probably a situation where we can't get store-bought yeast or bread. But really another positive with making the sourdough and the starters and everything, it's pretty easy to memorize the ratios. Like I was, when I would feed, I was doing a 1/4 cup of flour and a 1/4 cup of water. And I know some people use a food scale and they go by grams. So that's something you can do as well. I mean, with any recipe, I like getting to the point where I've memorized all the amounts and I don't have to look at a recipe. But I definitely keep a recipe binder because sometimes life happens and I go a long time without making something and then I need to revisit it and I forget the amounts. I'm also pleased that this got me to finally try my friend's cinnamon rolls, even though they were not sourdough. Like, my friend who makes the regular kind of cinnamon rolls had some amazing tips, and those cinnamon rolls are definitely going to be in the rotation at our house. But I decided I don't really need to find out what they taste like with sourdough. There's just no improving on the cinnamon rolls I already made, for me anyway, because sourdough isn't even my favorite kind of dough. And I realized that arguably, sourdough is a method of leavening your bread as opposed to a flavor of bread, and that you could make your so-called sourdough bread sweet. You could use it for different things. You could adjust the sourness. Well aware. I did a deep dive into it, folks. But for me, making that one batch of sourdough and making 2 baguettes with it was enough. The other con for me, I'm not going to give you TMI here, but just it gave me a stomach ache. I know it was the bread. No, I'm not gluten intolerant. I eat bread all the time, bake bread all the time, but something about it made my stomach hurt, and I started feeling better, and then I ate some of the leftover bread again. My stomach started hurting again, and I was visiting the restroom a lot. And no, it wasn't bad or anything. It was cramping up my stomach and making me gassy, for lack of a better word. Other cons are the fact that I'm recording this on a Wednesday. The sourdough bread was ready Tuesday morning, and there's still bread left over. And there are 8 people living in my house, which goes to show that it was not as popular as my sweet French, which disappears super fast. And lastly, my husband confessed that he likes my regular bread a lot better. And I mentioned the tough crust. It's kind of hard for my toddler grandkids to chew that crust. For me, the cons were the long wait, the short window of opportunity, the hard to chew crust, and the fact that it's less popular at my house, and that it disagreed with my stomach personally. But I think that if I was in a quote-unquote survival situation, I would adapt to that kind of bread over time. But there were a lot of pros. I learned a lot. And I'm also going to think about making 2 batches of bread dough at a time using regular commercial rapid rise yeast by using both my bread machine and the stand mixer together, because I had never made bread in the stand mixer. So that was something that I want to explore. And some of you who follow Clean With Me podcast on Facebook know that I made kind of an artisan style loaf of bread a while back in a Dutch oven, carved a cross into it. And so I want to make something like that again and go ahead and do the spinach dip bowl or the clam chowder bowl, which I have made a clam chowder bowl years ago. But I just don't have the time or patience to make a type of bread that we like a little less than the other kind. Was it good? Yes. Did I do it right? Yes, I feel I did, because it came out amazing. But my other bread is amazing as well, and our family likes it better. By the way, special thanks to our financial supporters who support the show either on Patreon by way of Spotify, Apple Podcasts, which is that little purple podcast app on iPhones, or the Spreaker Supporters Club, which is a link in the episode notes. If you want to learn about unlocking longer episodes by supporting us in any way, visit cleanwithmepodcast.com, or I'll put a couple links in the description, the episode notes, if you will. Don't forget to sweep and mop your kitchen after this if it needs it. Definitely consider baking your own bread if you're not too overwhelmed right now, whether it's sourdough or the easier kind of bread. Knowing that you're going to bake bread is definitely an incentive that helps you get your kitchen clean. It gives you something exciting to look forward to, and there's just something about the smell of bread baking in the oven. I hope you got your kitchen clean during this episode, and I hope you enjoyed my honest review of my experience with making sourdough bread. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.